Hello, Jeff Zwerink here, and welcome to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas and how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Mark Perez, and we are going to be investigating and discussing the effect of fallacies and cognitive biases on the scientific enterprise. Mark, it's good to have you here today.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be with you.
You know, when we think about science, we think about reason and rationality and evidence and finding the truth. It's kind of surprising to think that there are actually ways that science can be derailed if we don't think well. And that's kind of the topic of fallacies and cognitive biases. So why don't you start off our segment by just kind of explaining what are fallacies and cognitive biases?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll do that. So first of all, a fallacy is a mistake in reasoning that superficially doesn't look like a reasoning mistake. So fallacies have to do with reasoning. And a cognitive bias is a tendency to make errors in judgment or decision in certain conditions. And no one's immune to them. Even the most intelligent and well-educated people can have them, or do have them actually. It's universal. They're particularly important in science because they can show up anywhere in research or practice, and they have very serious consequences if they're not checked.
So let's kind of step back there. So you said a fallacy is it's a flaw in reasoning that on the surface doesn't look like it's a flaw in reasoning.
Yes.
Kind of flesh that out a little bit more. Maybe give us an example or something that people can relate to there.
Sure. There's an argument called an argument fallacy called cherry picking, and it's when you present an argument and you just present the evidence that you choose to substantiate your position. Now, in science, that can occur in a different way. Instead of just being an argument, it can be selecting only the results that are most favorable to your position. And this can show up, interestingly, in reporting things like research results. So if I do 20 experiments, 19 of the experiments don't give me anything that I want to have. But the 20th one comes up, and boom, it's confirming my thesis, my hypothesis. Well, you've just eliminated 19 pieces of evidence from the total picture. And that's called cherry picking. Now that has some very particular problems, pernicious problems actually, in science. And there was an interesting study done by a Harvard statistician in which he looked at a large number of medical research studies. And he concluded that statistically, you could not have that many positive results from the studies that came out. In other words, it was pretty obvious that there was some cherry picking going on. So what happens there, it undermines the confidence in the research. So cherry picking is a fallacy, and it can be a big problem.
That's kind of striking to me because you're looking at the data, you're actually looking at data that's really there. Unless you know that there's data that's missing, you're just not going to know that. It's an interesting fallacy there. So kind of go to the cognitive biases. Those seem less focused on what the data has to say, and what I'm thinking or what I want to be true. Is that correct?
Well, actually, a cognitive bias can be exactly what you want. But let's start with the first one that's well known in science, and that's a confirmation bias. So the confirmation bias, and all biases, by the way, are tendencies. They're not things that absolutely are going to happen every time. But a tendency to see or seek only the important information that confirms your theory, your favorite theory. And so the problem there is it can exclude important evidence that would falsify your theory or harm it. So if it harms your position and you're only looking for the things that are going to confirm your theory, what else are you doing? Well, what else you're doing is you're excluding important information that may be relevant to the research, but you've blinded yourself to it through this confirmation bias.
Yeah, that's again a very interesting phenomenon, especially considering the wealth of data we have about stuff. I mean, it used to be science and even just life in general was kind of data poor. It was tough to get information, but now there's just this abundance of information. It seems like that bias is we need to be particularly aware of that bias, especially as we're trying to figure out the truth of how creation works, if you will.
Absolutely. There are other fallacies and biases that can affect us as well. One of the interesting fallacies is a faulty analogy. And a faulty analogy in argument is you compare two things that you have that are similar enough they're very similar, but then you project that there's something more missing and you filter that in. Now, what happens in science, and this is very important, particularly medical research, is that you use analogical reasoning or analogies, for example, in animal studies.
Mm-hmm.
So in animal studies, the analogy is that a particular system in the human physiology is identical or similar to a physical system in a particular animal. Therefore, if we try a particular kind of therapy, say a cancer therapy, in the animal, then it'll translate to a human. Now that's an analogy. So the problem is that we find that there are faulty analogies there, and some of the statistics are actually quite shocking. So for cancer studies on animals, one study that evaluated them found 92% of the animal studies did not translate to humans. 92%. Now for stroke, there was something else, and that was for cancer. But for stroke, it ended up being somewhere around anywhere between 3 and 1%, maybe less. So what you have there is a big problem with faulty analogies in the comparison between the two animal physiologies and the humans and the animal, and how much similarity there really is. And when you get those kinds of results, what it shows is that the analogy is faulty and that you need to go back in and see what's different. At those kinds of rates, you really need to do some more basic research.
So that raises a question to me, and I'll throw it at you and see if this is an accurate way. You know, one of the arguments I've also often heard is, we're talking about the evolution creation debate, if you will, and there's an aspect of how something works that we don't know, and there's kind of this, well, science will find the answer to that, or evolution will explain that. It seems to me that's kind of drawing on, well, science has found lots of answers, and so we assume it will find every answer in the past. Would that be that sort of fallacy, or is that just something different that's going on?
Oh, that's actually very similar. It's called wishful thinking. It's actually the fallacy name for that. And that is the belief that the future resembles the past in ways that you can't prove. So merely because scientific enterprise has succeeded remarkably in the past to solve problems that seem to be intractable, you have to remember that there are problems in the past that seem to be intractable that actually were. And so merely because some of them get solved doesn't mean all of them will. And if you're going to say that we're going to have faith that in the future this is going to occur, you have to have some reason to believe that. Right. And so it's a pretty bald claim to say, or wishful thinking, to say that we have these really, really tough things that we have to get over, and we will definitely get over them when you have no way of proving that you have the means or mechanisms to do that.
So it sounds like, pretty clear here that cognitive biases and fallacies kind of wreak havoc on the integrity of the scientific process. So how do we go about dealing with or responding to or rooting them out, if you will? What's the best approach to getting rid of them so that we can actually get to the truth of the matter?
Well, there's no way to get rid of them. So that's the downside. The upside is that the more we know about them, the easier it is to identify them. And when it comes to tendencies, we have to look at when those tendencies arise. So if we're doing research, for example, the tendency towards a confirmation bias is one of those conditions where you're going to find it. So what do we do? How do we reverse that, or at least mitigate it? Well, the one thing to do is to ask yourself, what information am I not looking at? The researcher who does that is going to have a really great time avoiding that confirmation bias.
So it seems like it just requires not only assessing the data that's out there, but also kind of reflecting on your state of mind and your tendencies and bias and making sure you're being accurate and getting all the information as well.
Yes, it's slowing down your thinking, starting to look back on what could happen and go wrong, and then reversing that before you get going, particularly in confirmation biases, analogies, those kinds of things. They're actually easy to reverse, but you have to slow down, stop, and realize they're there, and then pay attention to them so they don't occur.
Actually sounds like good biblical advice. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate your comments.
My pleasure.
When we want to do science, it is really important that we actually get to measuring what's going on against the real world. And when we have fallacious reasoning or cognitive biases, that gets in the way of getting to the truth. And it's just incredibly important to identify and root out these fallacies so that we can get to the truth. Mark has written a lot about this, and in the new book that's come out, it's called Thinking About Evolution. Would you encourage you to go to reasons.org/2819, find out about the book, and get your copy today so you'll be prepared to root out these wrong ways of reasoning so that you can be more confident in spreading the truth.